From the mid-1990s until the release of Resident Evil 4 in 2005, the landscape of the survival horror game was haunted by the genre's biggest players. The golden age of survival horror was dominated by the likes of Capcom with their Resident Evil and Dino Crisis series, Konami with Silent Hill, and to a lesser extent even Squaresoft with Parasite Eve. The golden age of the survival horror genre was about making games that scared you, not just because of the story, the content, or the occasional jump scare, but at the threat that you'd lose an hour of progress because you just didn't have what it took to survive a combat encounter, or you just got stuck on an obstacle as you fled blood-sucking enemies. In my opinion, the PlayStation 1 was the undisputed king of the survival horror genre. When I think survival horror, I think PlayStation 1 with all its texture warping jankiness, highly constrained draw distances, and jaggy-edged polygons. I don't know if it was my favorite survival horror game, but Galerians holds a special place in my heart. Galerians was just one of a plethora of games that were sandwiched between the leviathans of the genre and the outlier titles that innovated and creeped around the fringes of the survival horror conventions. Titles like Galerians cleaved close to the tried and true survival horror formula of the Golden Age, but offered a few tweaks and variations on themes of their own to try and differentiate themselves from other also ran titles. Created by Polygon Magic, the developer responsible for the absolutely bonkers PS1 minigame collection Incredible Crisis, Galerians was released in 1999 to mostly positive reviews, though the game has since had a mostly spectral presence in the minds of most retro gamers, lost amidst glowing memories of its more genre-defining or genre-twisting competitors on the PlayStation family of consoles. Galerians occasionally pops up in hidden gem videos curated by PS1 fans and survival horror enthusiasts, but it is mostly treated like a forgotten B-side of the period. I remember being captivated enough by Galerians' far future sci-fi setting and its combat featuring psychic powers rather than the traditional arsenal of firearms to warrant multiple rentals from Blockbuster and a full playthrough or two of a game that I thoroughly loved. Like and subscribe to The Select Gaming for all our new spectacular reviews, long plays, and discussions of retro and modern classic video games. This is Galerians for the PlayStation. We are in the far future, the 26th century. You play as Rion, the game's protagonist, a 14-year-old boy who loves to rock a hairdo with messy bangs and who wakes up in a laboratory having been tortured and experimented upon. A seemingly unknown power unshackles Rion, and our protagonist soon discovers that he has been given psychic powers through bioexperimentation, powers which you promptly unleash to devastating effect on the lab coat-wearing minders who stand in your way. Details of the story are slowly established over the course of the game's opening hours, told through documents you discover strewn about the world, as well as through interspersed cutscenes. Rion's personal narrative and goal are simple. He hears the voice of a young girl, Lilia, who he feels some connection to, who calls out for his help, and Rion seeks to find and save her. But this personal narrative unfolds against quite an interesting sci-fi backdrop. Scientists working for an unnamed corporation have developed a sentient, self-replicating artificial intelligence, who they've named Dorothy. And Dorothy soon learned to expand their power and influence outside the initial intentions of her scientist creators, becoming a new god. Dorothy, using her godlike powers of creation, births, if that's the right word for it, the Galerians, who are a race of biologically engineered humans with psychic powers and who become Dorothy's disciples. But it's not just the titular Galerians that Dorothy crafts using her potential as a creator god, but also the ghost-faced rabbits, quasi-human figures who are fashioned to be mindless and fully subservient workers who can withstand extreme temperature conditions. Rion will need to destroy the rabbits, monstrous animals born of Dorothy's bio-experimentation, and the Galerians who, unlike Rion, appear to have their psychic powers heightened at the expense of their human capacity for free will, which seems to be suppressed deep within their genetic coding. Fearing the potential for Dorothy to unleash a wrath that would destroy all of those who oppose her will, Dorothy's creators hid two viral programs in the minds of Rion and Lilia as children that could be used together in combination to destroy Dorothy. And in fact, it is Dorothy's disciples who have captured Rion and are seeking to extract the program from him in the game's opening moments. So Rion's personal goal to find Lilia dovetails completely with the goal of exterminating Dorothy. Rion's position in this world, his identity, his past, his family, and his free will are themes explored throughout the character's journey. But more broadly, the story touches on the ethics of self-motivated and self-sustaining artificial intelligence, on the ethics of human bioengineering, on global systems that control our lives. In truth, a deep philosophical inquiry, Galerians is not, but the occasional breadcrumb gesturing at a more complex world hiding below the game's surface is more than welcome, and it complements other 90s survival horror juggernauts in their similarly shallow but nonetheless welcome interest in themes of bioethics told in a story that's thematically interested in corporate control of daily lives. We've uploaded a complete playthrough of Galerians to the Select Extras for you to watch if you'd like to spook your way through the game with us. The game's cutscenes have that distinctive look of late 90s computer-generated 3D animation. Characters appear fairly wooden and stiff, with only the very slightest of animations occasionally featuring as facial expressions. I've always thought that the era's technological limitations for rendering three-dimensional characters yielded figures that appeared more like plastic marionettes than even synthetic representations of humans. In-engine but nonetheless pre-rendered cutscenes, especially in Disc 2's hotel scenes, appear equally stilted as characters rotate awkwardly in place or appear to have their dialogue mismatched to character movement. The game does feature the CD-based console generation signature Red Book audio for a decent smattering of character voices during story-heavy moments, especially in the locations featured across Discs 2 and 3. To be clear, character voiceovers don't particularly hold up to modern naturalistic aesthetic standards either, seemingly voiced by whichever developer in Japan or localization team member they could stuff into a recording booth in short order. Both the game's audio and its character presentation feel stilted and stiff, but I feel like these once aesthetic drawbacks have sort of looped back around in the modern era to become distinctive and maybe even desirable traits of a time and place in video game history, the aesthetic markers of naive aesthetic design in a developing video game industry. And so today, if anything, they might be read as good and valuable, appreciated if nothing else than for nostalgic reasons. The pre-rendered environments of Galerians are reasonably varied and visually interesting in and of themselves. A laboratory, a mansion, which is a classic of the genre, a dank hotel, and Dorothy's facility that is mostly a standard, clean, futuristic environment, apart from some really cool H.R. Geiger-esque bio-industrial birthing area that's near to the final boss. That looks like it's ribbed with red vein-like lines sprawling across the walls and ceilings. Genuinely pretty cool. The laboratory in particular in Disc 1 with its sharp and cool gray interior is smattered with detailed objects that makes otherwise sparse environments really pop. The same compliments can't be rendered forth for character and boss designs. All look, well, kind of strange, awkward, and off-putting. And not in a good way or even in an interesting uncanny valley way either. The characters are a small blight on an otherwise somewhat antiquated if charming aesthetic for the game. Still, One can't imagine the game's rather artificial seeming presentation surviving into any possible remaster, even if the prospect of that ever happening seems wholly remote. In truth, the modern appeal of Galerians will probably be limited heavily by the game's control scheme. The golden age of survival horror games were characterized by their utilization of tank controls. So called because a character's movements are restricted to forward and reverse, the directions of which are handled separately through rotational controls that you input using the directional pad. Galerians does feature analog stick controllers using Sony's revolutionary first generation DualShock controller, but I found the slightly older convention of using the directional pad together with L2 to trigger Rion's run animation to yield more granular control. Ape Escape had only recently shown developers the way forward with analog stick controls. Tank controls most obviously shape character movement, but this isn't the only facet of a player's experience that are touched by this convention of highly directionalized controls in pre-rendered environments. It was fundamental to the survival portion of the survival horror genre to have tank controls. In addition to having players ration their supplies, mastering the game's tank controls became a way for developers to constrain a player's capacity to become a limitless deathbringer to all enemies. Galerians is a pretty good example of this factor of survival horror gameplay. Tank control limitations force Rion into the all too familiar J-hook movement, where you run away to create space between you and your adversary, then you round off the J movement and hope you built up enough space to charge your weapon and get a blast in. These controls are one of the more enduring frustrations that some people experience with the genre, though survival horror aficionados will have no problem in Galerians dispensing enemies with a plum. Conventional though these controls may be, it doesn't make it any less frustrating when you get hitched up on a corner that causes you to die and lose a chunk of your gameplay progress. Galerians differs from the typical survival horror game in putting aside projectile weapons in exchange for psychic powers. Rion can use a psychic blast that exerts a pushing force, a fire blast that engulfs enemies, and a late game telekinetic force that allows you to pick up and drop enemies onto their face. The fire blast in particular is so satisfying to hit, and it's about on par with the taser in the original Siphon Filter, albeit without the sadistic pleasure of that game's acoustic design. The same can't be said for the telekinetic lift and drop attack, which arrives so late and works on so few enemies that you'll only ever find yourself relying on the push force and fire attacks. This effectively limits your already meager attacking options from 3 to, in actual practice, a properly famished 2. Rion injects himself with vials that power your attacks, so making sure that you have sufficient quantities of your 2 primary attacks squirreled away in your inventory is a strategic necessity for beating the game. That being said, making sure that you have enough space in your inventory for other necessary items is always a bit of a hassle given the game's opaque and unsatisfying inventory system, where all your holdings are listed in a bland row rather than the more elegant briefcase solutions created by better survival horror titles. Items can be collected and consumed that allows Rion to upgrade the level force of his attack and how fast your attack charges up too. Though be careful, since getting knocked below a certain health will drop you back down to the base level. Maintaining your attack level up across stages is something of a skill in and of itself, though you shouldn't find yourself struggling in any serious way by not maintaining a level 2 or 3 attack. You're not particularly limited by consuming level up pills that can't be remedied with patience, reasonably skilled movement, and the ability to identify patterns of attacks yielded by enemies. Not all is lost though, as Rion will slowly accumulate more and more anger points, and this will trigger a traumatic psychic break, or what the game calls shorting. And when you short, enemy brains are burst by merely being in proximity to Rion. If you time these right by keeping an eye on the charging meter in your HUD, you can use Rion's shorting to wipe out a room of particularly troublesome characters. Not all enemies, mind you, but enough enemies are vulnerable to the powerful attacks generated that carefully timing Rion's shorting can get you out of a bind when you're low on fluids that power your standard attacks. Just make sure you keep a spot in your inventory for a pill or two that reverses the effects of shorting, or it's game over for you. I simply can't recall a collection of these types of attacking features in any other survival horror game of the period. The shorting hindrance appears in theory to be something of a timer that would force players to hurry through the game, but in reality the attacking capabilities of shorting make up for the unfortunately lean attacking offerings of the game's base weapons, even if there's something undercooked about the attacking system in general. The psychic attacks offer an interesting variation on the standard firearms-based combat of survival horror games, even if the actual experience of combat itself feels fairly standard. And the limitations in attacking options effectively render the boss encounters uneventful. They become about using what are essentially the only two weapons you really have at your disposal, simply executing your plan to fruition. This feels antithetical to the best bosses that the golden era of survival horror has to offer. Complex chess battles that make you think about what weapons you will use and how you'll use them. You'll find yourself dying repeatedly at one boss or another because of a random particular quirk in their attacking pattern or the movement of your character in the environment you find yourself in, like the seemingly incomprehensible invisible walls that appear in the near to final battle. Other bosses are just, boring and feel under-considered. Think about Rita, who's the boss at the end of the hotel level, as a classic example. In the game so far, we've had a character who throws fire, another who teleports and fires psychic orbs at you, and a third who's basically half robot. And so what's Rita's special attack? Well, she throws furniture at you and rides a table across the room. Really? That's the best we can do. And yet for whatever reason I had more trouble with the IKEA wielding Rita than even the game's final boss, just because I couldn't quite get the dodge moment right, whereas the godlike Dorothy was dispatched without Rion even breaking a sweat. And like the combat puzzles, the game's environmental puzzles, things like unlocking doors, meeting up with characters, or finding your way to the next objective when a pathway is blocked, these are all pretty standard stuff. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes it's fun just playing a genre title without expecting it to be a world beater. But as with the hotel level where non-playable characters basically tell you every step along the way with little mystery to it, it feels like some of the challenge of Galerians has been macheted through by the developers who just lead you by the nose. That, or they force you to crawl from door to door, object to object, pressing triangle for Rion to scan objects in the hopes you might just find something useful. It's a harsh callback to the click-a-thon adventure games of the early 1990s. And it's rendered especially frustrating because the pre-rendered environments don't have little objects that make them obvious sites to search. And so, these features alone can leave those uninitiated with this type of gameplay feeling rather left out. A limited array of psychic powers in a game that's about using psychic powers, one of which you only get halfway through the game and barely get to use. Bosses with combat puzzles that are uneven in their complexity, and cutscenes with snippets of dialogue and animations that give "You're almost a Jill sandwich" a run for their money in terms of being stilted and unbelievable.
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
You're right. Barry, thanks for saving my life.
All of these things together give the impression of a game whose details of mechanics and puzzles were half-baked, hastily assembled around an intriguing core combat idea and an interesting world. Did the developers of this game just not have enough time to implement their cool ideas? Is this really a game we ought to resurrect for the modern era? Short of a full reconceptualization, it's hard to imagine that Galerians will ever receive the remastered treatment on its own merits. I'm glad to have used the occasion of Halloween to revisit the game, even if my own experience was decidedly mixed. Galerians was a game that was successful enough as a property, especially in its home region of Japan, to spawn an art book and even an eventual sequel for the PlayStation 2 called Galerians Ash, also developed by Polygon Magic and released in 2002. In that sequel, Rion is once again pressed into service, wiping out the Galerians that Dorothy populated the world with in her dying days at the end of the first game. But in 4 real-world years, the Galerians franchise was birthed into existence and faded into oblivion. But a franchise expanding into multiple different media forms is still a pretty strong legacy for a game that nowadays hardly gets mentioned alongside the more enduring survival horror titles of the golden era. Galerians Ash was given decidedly negative to mixed reviews, effectively ending the series' commercial prospects. Galerians Ash has long been on my backlog to experience, but after revisiting Galerians for the original PlayStation, I'm not so sure I'm ready for that experience. In retrospect, Galerians feels like a game that is too much of its time and place, a relic of a game that was trying desperately to differentiate itself in an extremely crowded field. I appreciate going back and playing games that time forgot, games that try to capitalize on a trend and made tweaks around the edges to distinguish itself from others. It's difficult for me to look at Galerians, a game I so much enjoyed back in the day, and see anything but the game's unreached potential. I appreciate Galerians for what it is, and it was genuinely satisfying to find myself traversing the same corridors, like revisiting an old friend. And yet I found myself feeling cold to the touch and returning to the title after all these years, seeing a game that was constantly reaching and missing a goal that exceeds its grasp, haunted by the feeling that what I experienced in my most recent playthrough for the Select was a game that was a ghost of what it could have been. Thanks for watching this special Halloween-themed episode of The Select Gaming. If you like our approach to games coverage at The Select and that we aren't afraid to honestly reappraise our nostalgic experiences even of our own gaming past, we would appreciate your support by liking this video and subscribing to our channel as we make our way to 1,000 subscribers. We'd like to hear what you thought about Galerians in the comments and let us know what survival horror game we should review next. We create videos for The Select that are guided by our personal interests, and your support makes that possible.